A young girl vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine school trip, leaving behind nothing but questions and heartbreak. 8 years passed with no answers, no closure for the family who never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. Then, against all odds, her camera washed ashore, revealing shocking images that would finally unravel the mystery that had haunted them for nearly a decade. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Willamette River swelled beyond recognition after 3 days of relentless summer downpour. Its muddy waters churned angrily through Eugene, Oregon, uprooting century-old trees and carrying debris from miles upstream. John Smith stood on the slippery bank, his fishing rod forgotten in his weathered hands. The retired firefighter had seen plenty of floods during his 32 years of service, but something about this one felt different, almost purposeful. A flash of ink caught his eye among the tangle of exposed roots and river silt. John carefully navigated the treacherous mud, his knees protesting with each step. What he initially thought might be trash turned out to be a small digital camera, its once bright casing now faded and battered by years of exposure. He turned it over in his palm, his breath catching when he saw the crude etching on the back. Emily Johnson scratched into the plastic with what must have been a safety pin. "Dear God," he whispered, the weight of the discovery settling heavy on his shoulders. Within hours, the news raced through Eugene faster than the floodwaters themselves. The camera passed from John's trembling hands to the local police station, where Officer Ramirez recognized the name immediately. Every officer in town knew the Johnson case. 8 years ago, 12-year-old Emily Johnson had vanished without a trace during a school camping trip in the Cascade Forests. The search had consumed the community for months, volunteers combing every inch of woodland, divers exploring the deeper parts of the river, helicopters scanning from above. John himself had led one of the search teams, returning home each night with mud-caked boots and diminishing hope. At the edge of town, in a small house with faded blue shutters, Laura Johnson received the call she had both longed for and dreaded. For 8 years, she had lived in a peculiar state of suspended grief, unable to move forward, yet refusing to accept that her daughter was gone. The walls of her home remained adorned with Emily's artwork, her bedroom preserved like a shrine to possibility. "We found something, Mrs. Johnson," the officer said, his voice carefully measured. "A camera. It has Emily's name on it." Laura's fingers tightened around the phone as memories flooded back. Emily's 12th birthday, unwrapping the pink camera she'd begged for, her eyes lighting up as she immediately began documenting everything around her. The last photos Laura had seen were from the morning of the camping trip. Emily's backpack packed neatly by the door, her hiking boots lined up perfectly beside it. "I'll be right there," she whispered, already reaching for her car keys, her heart thundering with a dangerous spark of hope. The pink camera sat on Detective Wilson's desk at the Eugene police station, its once vibrant color dulled by years of water damage. Laura Johnson couldn't take her eyes off it, this small plastic object that might hold answers about her daughter's fate. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward it, only to have the detective gently intercept her hand. "Oh, we need to handle it carefully, Mrs. Johnson," he explained. "Our tech team will extract whatever data they can." Laura nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. 8 years of searching, of hoping, of grief suspended in uncertainty, all potentially contained in this waterlogged device marked with Emily's name. 3 days later, the call came. One memory card had survived, protected by a rubber seal that had somehow maintained its integrity. Laura rushed to the station, heart hammering against her ribs. The technician, a young woman with kind eyes, guided her to a small viewing room where a laptop displayed the recovered files, 26 photographs and 3 video clips. "The last file is timestamped 2 days after Emily was reported missing," the technician said softly. Laura pressed her palm against her mouth, stifling a sob. Her daughter had been alive, at least for those 48 hours. The first images were exactly what you'd expect from a 12-year-old on a school camping trip. Emily's classmates laughed around a campfire, marshmallows on sticks, faces illuminated by golden flames. Several photos showcased Emily's talent for drawing, detailed sketches of native birds, each labeled in her neat handwriting. Morning fog curled through pine trees, capturing the ethereal beauty of dawn in the Cascades. She always had an eye for detail, Laura whispered, touching the screen where Emily had photographed a spider's web jeweled with dew. But as the sequence progressed, the images shifted tone. Photo 17 showed a crude totem carved from a fallen branch, its face neither human nor animal. The next captured a perfect circle of stones arranged on forest moss, too deliberate to be natural. Laura leaned closer, her breath fogging the screen. "Did the search teams find any of these structures?" she asked. The detective shook his head. "Not that I'm aware of." The 23rd photo made Laura gasp. Emily had captured her own reflection in a rain-streaked window, likely from inside the ranger's cabin. Her daughter's eyes were wide, searching with an intensity Laura had never seen before. She wasn't frightened, she looked awakened. "Can we see the videos?" Laura asked, her voice barely audible. The technician nodded, cursor hovering over the first file. Laura braced herself, knowing that in moments she would hear her daughter's voice again, a voice that had existed only in her dreams for 8 long years. Laura Johnson's hands trembled as she pressed play on the recovered video. The image flickered to life, revealing her daughter's face, those familiar hazel eyes, that gentle smile. Emily had pulled her chestnut hair back into a messy ponytail, wisps framing her face as she leaned close to the camera. "I found something today," Emily whispered, her voice soft but clear. "There are patterns in the moss here, like someone arranged them deliberately." The camera panned shakily across a fallen log, where intricate swirls of green moss formed what looked like concentric circles. "And the strangest thing happens when you speak near the big hollow tree. Voices echo back what you say, but different somehow." Laura pressed her fingertips to the screen, aching to reach through time and space to touch her child. Emily continued in that thoughtful, measured way that had always made her seem older than 12. "Nobody notices these things," she murmured. "The other kids are too busy with their games and gossip. It's like I'm invisible to them." A pause, then more quietly. "But out here, I feel seen. It's weird, like the forest is watching me back." The mother wiped away tears as the first clip ended. 8 years of wondering, of imagining the worst. And now here was Emily, alive and curious in these final moments before she vanished. The second video started abruptly. The image bounced wildly as Emily ran, her breathing heavy and quick. When the camera steadied, it focused on a tree trunk where someone had carved an intricate symbol, a spiral with 3 lines radiating outward. "I found it," she gasped, excitement evident in her voice. "This is where the story says you can cross." The camera zoomed in on the carving, revealing its weathered edges. That book in the school library, the one about local legends, it mentioned markers like this. "They're supposed to be doorways or something." Laura felt a chill as her daughter's voice dropped to a whisper. "I came out here alone to find it. Nobody would believe me anyway." The forest around Emily seemed unnaturally still. No bird song, no rustling leaves. Just silence, as if the woods were holding their breath. "Listen." "It feels different here," Emily murmured, the camera panning slowly around the clearing, like the trees are paying attention. A twig snapped somewhere off camera, and Emily startled. "Hello," she called, but received no answer except the faint echo of her own voice, distorted and strange. The clip ended abruptly, leaving Laura staring at a blank screen, her heart racing with a mother's instinct that something had been there in those woods. Something that had noticed her curious, lonely child. Laura Johnson stared at the pink camera with trembling hands, her heart racing with a desperate hope she hadn't felt in years. For 8 long years she had lived in a purgatory of grief and uncertainty, never knowing what had happened to her 12-year-old daughter. She had never stopped searching, putting up new flyers when the old ones faded, calling the police station for updates that never came, walking the forest trails until her shoes wore through. But now, finally, there was something tangible. Something. "I need to call Michael," she whispered, reaching for her phone. Michael Brown had been just 12 himself when Emily disappeared, her closest friend and confidant. Now 20, he worked as a wilderness guide in the same forests that had swallowed Emily whole, as if trying to make peace with the landscape that haunted him. The guilt had never left Michael. That morning, Emily had slipped him a folded note during breakfast at the campsite. He'd shoved it into his pocket, planning to read it later when their teacher wasn't watching. By the time he remembered it, Emily was already gone. The note, which he'd kept all these years, contained just one line: "Meet me at the East Trailhead before sunrise. I found something amazing." "I should have gone," Michael told Laura, as they sat in the sterile conference room of the Eugene police station. "If I'd just read that stupid note." His voice cracked, and he stared down at his calloused hands. Laura reached across the table. "You were just a child yourself." Together they hunched over a laptop, reviewing the recovered footage frame by frame. Emily's videos showed her methodical exploration, close-ups of moss patterns, the way sunlight filtered through branches, a peculiar arrangement of stones that seemed deliberately placed. "Wait," Michael said suddenly, leaning closer to the screen. "Go back." The officer rewound the clip. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, a shadow moved independently of the trees. Not wind, not an animal. "There," Michael pointed, his finger trembling. "That shouldn't be there." In another clip, they heard it, the rhythmic drip of water echo in darkness, though Emily was filming in daylight. The sound didn't match the environment she was recording. "She found a cave," Michael whispered. "She must have. That's the echo you get underground." Laura pressed her hands to her mouth. "Why wouldn't she tell anyone?" "Because she wanted to show me first," Michael replied, the weight of 8 years of guilt crushing his words. "That's what the note was about. She found something, and I was supposed to go with her." The wilderness guide stood up, determination replacing remorse in his eyes. "I know these forests better than anyone now. If there's a cave system out there that's not on the maps, I'll find it." Helen Davis sat at her kitchen table, tea gone cold, watching the evening news with trembling hands. The pink camera's Discovery dominated every channel. Each time they showed the image of Emily Johnson's recovered device, Helen felt her chest tighten. She turned the volume down but couldn't bring herself to switch it off completely. 8 years of carefully constructed denial threatened to collapse. Helen had organized that fateful school camping trip as she had dozens before it, meticulously planning activities, assigning buddy systems, checking weather forecasts. Yet, despite all her preparation, she had failed in the most fundamental way. That crisp morning, while other teachers were busy preparing breakfast, Helen had glimpsed Emily slipping away from the campsite. The girl had moved with purpose, clutching her pink camera, heading toward the dense tree line where mist still clung to the forest floor. Helen had noticed and done nothing. She told herself Emily was just taking pictures, that she'd return momentarily. By the time the official headcount revealed a missing student, it was too late. "I was 3 years from retirement," Helen whispered to her empty living room, justifying her silence to ghosts. Her pension, her reputation, her legacy, all would have crumbled if she'd admitted seeing Emily leave. So she'd said nothing during the frantic search, nothing during the investigation, nothing during the years that followed. The retired teacher rose stiffly and walked to her bedroom closet. Behind winter coats and old sweaters lay a small wooden box. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a sketch Emily had done during class the week before the trip. It showed strange symbols copied from a book in the school library, symbols Helen had recognized from local folklore, but dismissed as childish fascination. Helen traced the markings with her fingertip. She remembered Emily's questions about local legends, her interest in the echoing places mentioned in old stories. The girl had been researching something specific, something that had drawn her into those woods with deliberate intent. Through her window, Helen could see the edge of the Cascade forests. Her modest house sat closer to the wilderness than most in Eugene, a daily reminder of her silence. Sometimes, on particularly still nights, she imagined she could hear laughter carried on the wind. A young girl's laughter, distant but distinct. The news anchor announced that Laura Johnson would be holding a press conference tomorrow. Helen switched off the television. She should come forward, tell Laura everything about seeing Emily leave, about the drawings, about the book of legends the girl had been reading. But fear kept her rooted in place, just as it had for 8 long years. The truth might bring closure to a grieving mother, but it would destroy what remained of Helen's carefully preserved life. Laura Johnson clutched the worn leather book to her chest as she climbed the creaking porch steps of the small craftsman home on the outskirts of Eugene. The weathered sign reading Garcia Historical Research swung gently in the autumn breeze. She had heard about Robert Garcia from several townspeople, a man who collected local legends the way others collected stamps or coin. Robert Garcia welcomed her with kind eyes that seemed to hold centuries of stories. His living room walls were covered with maps marked with colored pins, newspaper clippings, and faded photographs of the Cascade forests. These disappearances follow patterns, Robert explained, spreading out yellow documents across his dining table. Every 8 years, like clockwork. Most were written off as accidents or runaways, but I've tracked 17 cases since 1870. His finger traced a timeline where Emily's name appeared at the very end. Laura's voice trembled. You think my daughter is part of some pattern? The locals called them the Echoing Ones, Robert continued, retrieving a journal bound in cracked leather. Figures that appear to those who wander alone in certain parts of the forest. They're said to echo back what you say, but slightly changed, drawing you deeper with each response. When Laura showed him the recovered footage from Emily's camera, Robert's expression darkened. He recognized the symbols Emily had filmed, carvings he'd documented in his research, but never fully understood. My grandmother should see this, he said quietly. Sofia Garcia sat in a rocking chair by the window, her silver hair pulled back in a long braid. At 87, her hands were gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes remained sharp as she studied the images on the laptop screen. The forest speaks, she said in a voice weathered by time. It has always spoken to those who listen. The elder pointed to Emily's video where the girl whispered about patterns in the moss. She heard it. The forest chose her. Chose her? Laura's voice cracked. What does that mean? Sophia's eyes softened with compassion. The woods are not just trees and dirt, they are alive, watching, listening. When your daughter spoke to the forest, it answered her. These videos show a conversation, not just a girl talking to herself. Robert translated some of his grandmother's more complex explanations about the spiritual beliefs of her people, how certain souls were called by the wild places, how the boundaries between worlds grew thin in specific locations. Emily wasn't just lost, Sophia concluded, her weathered hand covering Laura's. She was invited, and from what I see in these images, she accepted that invitation. Laura stared at the frozen image of her daughter's face on the screen, wondering if Emily had found something in those woods that she couldn't find at home, something ancient and wild that had been calling her name all along. Detective James Wilson slid the final photograph across the table. Laura Johnson's hands trembled as she picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. The image, blurry and overexposed, showed the river's reflective surface capturing something that sent ice through her veins, a figure wearing Emily's purple backpack, with the distinctive butterfly patch. But this wasn't her 12-year-old daughter. The reflection revealed someone taller, with longer hair cascading past their shoulders, the face too indistinct to identify. That's not Emily, Laura whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the police station's air conditioning. But that's definitely her backpack. I sewed that butterfly patch on myself. Michael Brown leaned forward, his 20-year-old frame tense with concentration. The wilderness guide's eyes weren't on the figure but fixed on the background details of the photograph. Something about the riverbank looked familiar, a distinctive split where water had carved through moss-covered stone, creating a natural archway that hung over the water. I know this place, he said suddenly, tapping the edge of the photo. It's not on any official park map. The rangers call it Whisper Creek, but it's technically off-limits too, unstable for hikers. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. Guilt had been his constant companion for 8 years. Ever since he ignored that folded note Emily had slipped him the morning she disappeared. He'd been too caught up with impressing the older kids to meet her at the trailhead as she'd asked. Now, staring at his ceiling, he made a decision. Before dawn, he packed his gear and called in sick to the tour company. His supervisor wouldn't be happy. Peak season meant full bookings, but Michael couldn't wait. He left a voicemail for Laura explaining his plan, then headed into the forest with the photograph tucked safely in his waterproof case. The hike took 4 hours, pushing through overgrown trails and navigating terrain that grew increasingly unfamiliar. The mossy outcrop appeared suddenly around a bend, exactly as it looked in the photo, a natural stone arch draped in emerald green, with the river rushing beneath it. Michael's heart pounded as he approached. The ground here felt different, almost vibrating beneath his boots. He knelt by the water's edge, exactly where the photographer must have stood. Something glinted in the mud. A small metal button with the logo of Emily's middle school. His hands shook as he bagged the evidence. Someone had been here wearing Emily's backpack, long after she vanished. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about finding a missing girl anymore. This was about uncovering what or who Emily had become in the 8 years since she disappeared. The manila envelope sat on Laura Johnson's porch, unmarked and unexpected. She nearly missed it while fumbling for her house keys, exhausted after another day of reviewing the camera footage with the police. Inside was nothing but a single fern frond, vibrant green and perfectly intact, its delicate leaves unfurled as if freshly plucked from forest soil. Laura's hands trembled as she held it to the light. This wasn't just any fern, it was identical to the maidenhair species. Emily had carefully pressed between wax paper for her 6th grade biology project. The memory surfaced with painful clarity. Her daughter's meticulous notes, the way she'd labeled each part in her neat handwriting. But this specimen wasn't dried or preserved. Dewdrops still clung to its edges. "This was picked today," she whispered to the empty house, her voice catching. Was someone cruelly toying with her grief? Or was this a breadcrumb leading toward her daughter? She called Michael immediately. The young wilderness guide arrived within 20 minutes, his face grave as he examined the plant. "This variety doesn't grow near town," he said, carefully placing the fern in a plastic bag. "It needs specific conditions, shade, moisture, protected areas. Someone went deep into the forest to find this." That evening, Detective Wilson contacted Laura about a second video clip they'd managed to recover from the damaged memory card. She rushed to the station, heart pounding with equal parts hope and dread. The footage was grainier than the first, but Emily's voice came through with haunting clarity. Her daughter appeared pale but strangely composed, speaking directly into the camera. "I found it, the place where echoes answer," Emily whispered, her breath visible in the cool air. "It's exactly like the book described. When you speak, your words come back different, like someone else is answering." The camera panned shakily away from her face, revealing a dark opening in a hillside. The entrance was partially obscured by twisted branches that curved inward like beckoning fingers. Laura gasped, recognizing elements from Robert Garcia's local legends, the cave where the echoing ones were said to dwell. "I'm going inside tomorrow," Emily continued, her voice dropping lower. "I left markers so I can find my way back. The symbols match the ones in Mr. Garcia's book." The video ended abruptly, leaving Laura frozen in her seat. This wasn't the frightened recording of a lost child. Emily had been exploring deliberately, following something that called to her curiosity. She wasn't running away, Laura murmured. She was running towards something. The fern sat in its evidence bag, impossibly fresh after 8 years of absence. Someone wanted her to know. Emily's story hadn't ended at the campsite. It had only begun. Anna Martinez hunched over her laboratory desk, her eyes fixed on the high-resolution printouts of Emily's photographs. The botanist had been working for 3 days straight, analyzing every plant visible in the images recovered from the pink camera. Something about the moss patterns had immediately caught her attention. They weren't typical of the forest floor. "This isn't possible," Anna whispered, comparing the specimens in Emily's photos to her reference guides. She reached for her phone and called Laura Johnson. "I found something," she told Emily's mother, her voice tight with excitement. "The Pseudocryptogyra fontinalis in these images, it's a rare moss variety that only grows in complete darkness, typically deep inside cave systems. Emily must have gone underground after she disappeared." Laura's breath caught audibly on the other end of the line. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely," the botanist replied. "And there's more. The fern species in the later photos, it's bioluminescent. It requires moisture and absolute darkness to thrive." Whatever Emily was photographing, she ventured far from any casual hiking path. Within hours, the news spread through the small Oregon town. Volunteer search teams that had dwindled over the years suddenly swelled with renewed purpose. Maps were unfurled across tables at the police station as Michael Brown marked potential cave entrances based on his knowledge of the terrain. "The river valley has dozens of unmapped sinkholes and cave systems," he explained, tracing his finger along the topographical lines. Some were sealed off decades ago for safety reasons, but others remained completely undocumented. Meanwhile, Robert Garcia had been working on a theory of his own. The local historian spread his research across Laura's kitchen table, newspaper clippings, missing persons reports, and handwritten notes from his grandmother's stories. "Look at this," Robert said, placing a transparent overlay on the forest map. Red pins marked the locations of historical disappearances dating back nearly a century. Each case, spaced exactly 8 years apart, all within the same 5-mile radius of River Valley. Laura stared at the pattern, her fingers trembling as they traced the connections. "This can't be coincidence. My grandmother warned me about this place," Robert continued, his voice low. "The echoing ones choose carefully, always following the same cycle." The search teams moved through the forest with renewed determination, using ground-penetrating radar to locate hidden caverns beneath the forest floor. As daylight faded, they discovered a narrow fissure in the rock face, partially concealed by fallen trees, exactly matching the background of Emily's final photograph. Michael volunteered to be the first to enter, securing his headlamp as he prepared to squeeze through the opening. Laura watched him, hope and dread battling within her heart. Whatever lay beyond that darkness, they were finally getting closer to the truth about what happened to her daughter. Helen Davis sat in her living room, surrounded by dusty botany books and the weight of 8 years of silence. The news of Emily Johnson's camera had shaken her to the core. Her hands trembled as she dialed Laura's number, knowing the time for secrets had finally passed. When Laura arrived, the retired biology teacher could barely meet her eyes. The small house at the edge of the woods felt suffocating as Helen finally spoke the truth. "I saw her that morning," Helen confessed, her voice barely audible. "Emily was slipping away from the campsite before sunrise. She had her camera and that little notebook she always carried." The older woman's shoulders slumped. "I should have called out, should have stopped her, but I was afraid of causing trouble. The school was already questioning my field trip protocols." Laura's face transformed from confusion to rage. "You knew? All this time?" Her voice cracked with 8 years of grief. "We searched for months. I lost everything looking for her." Helen nodded, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I convinced myself she had just gone to take pictures and would return. When she didn't," her voice trailed off. "By then, admitting what I'd seen meant admitting negligence. I was 3 years from retirement, from my pension." The confession grew darker as Helen revealed the true reason for her early departure from teaching. 6 months after Emily disappeared, one of my students, Lily Chen, came to me terrified. She'd been collecting water samples for our ecology project when she heard someone calling her name from deep in the woods. Helen's hands shook. She swore it was Emily's voice, saying the forest had secrets. Laura gripped the armchair, knuckles white. "And you still said nothing?" "I reported it to the principal, who accused me of encouraging hysteria. They forced me into early retirement to quiet things down." Helen pulled out a faded journal. "But I started research." "Emily wasn't the first, Laura. Every 8 years, someone young disappears near that same stretch of forest. Always someone curious, sensitive to their surroundings." Laura's anger remained, but something else crept in, a horrified understanding. "You think something in those woods is calling to them?" Helen nodded slowly. "Robert Garcia's grandmother told stories about the echoing ones. I dismissed them as superstition until I started seeing the pattern." She pushed the journal toward Laura. "Emily might have been chosen long before that camping trip." As Laura left Helen's house, her fury was tempered with an unsettling realization. Her daughter's disappearance was part of something ancient, something that had been drawing children into the wilderness for generations. The camera wasn't just evidence, it was an invitation to follow. The Oregon Wildlife Conservation Team never expected to capture anything more than deer and the occasional cougar on their motion-triggered camera. Installed to monitor animal migration patterns in the protected wilderness area, the device instead recorded something far more startling: a teenage girl, barefoot and dirty, her long hair matted with leaves, sprinting through the frame at dusk. The image reached Park Ranger Thomas Wilkins first. He stared at the blurry figure, 7 miles from where Emily Johnson had vanished 8 years earlier. The girl's face was partially obscured, but something in her movement, the determined set of her shoulders, sent a chill through him. Within 24 hours, the photograph had mysteriously disappeared from the official database. Michael Brown, however, had connections. His years as a wilderness guide had built relationships with rangers and conservationists throughout the Cascades. A sympathetic colleague slipped him a grainy printout, her hands trembling as she passed it across a coffee shop table. "This shouldn't exist," she whispered. "Someone high up ordered all copies destroyed." The young guide stared at the image for hours that night, comparing it to childhood photos of his lost friend. The girl in the picture was taller, wilder, but the way she moved, that was Emily. He'd recognized that determined stride anywhere. When Laura Johnson saw the printout, her coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on her kitchen floor. Neither of them moved to clean up the mess. "It could be her," Laura whispered, her voice breaking with 8 years of hope. "My Emily could still be alive out there." The next morning they set out together, following coordinates from the wildlife camera. The forest welcomed them with its usual indifference, birds calling, leaves rustling, sunlight filtering through the canopy. Michael led the way, his experienced eyes scanning for signs of human passage. 3 hours into their hike, Laura spotted it, a small object dangling from a low-hanging branch. As they approached, her heart raced. A hand-carved wooden charm shaped like a swallow hung from a frayed string, swaying gently in the breeze. "This is from her school bracelet," Laura whispered, fingers trembling as she touched the delicate carving. Emily made friendship bracelets for her whole class that year. She always loved swallows. Michael examined the carving close. The craftsmanship was precise, made with a sharp blade and steady hands. Not the work of a 12-year-old girl, but perhaps of a practiced teenager who had grown up in the wilderness. "Someone wants us to follow," he said, his voice low with wonder and apprehension. "Either Emily is leaving us a trail, or," Laura finished his thought, "or someone wants us to believe she's still out there." They continued deeper into the forest, hope and dread mingling with each step. The wilderness seemed to watch them, patient and ancient, as if it had been waiting for this moment for 8 long years. Robert Garcia sat surrounded by stacks of yellowed newspaper clippings in his small study. The historian had been meticulously documenting a pattern so chilling it made his skin crawl. The disappearance of Emily Johnson wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a cycle that had haunted Eugene for generations. "Every 8 years," he whispered, tracing his finger along a timeline he'd created. Like clockwork, the names and faces changed, but the circumstances remained eerily similar. Young people vanishing near the Cascade forests, strange symbols carved into trees, and fresh ferns appearing mysteriously afterward. Robert's grandmother, Sophia, watched from the doorway, her weathered hands clutching a mug of tea. The indigenous elder had warned the community for decades about the forest's true nature. "They are offerings," she explained, sitting beside her grandson. "The watchers of the woods demand tribute. Those who go willingly become part of their world." Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, reflected generations of wisdom the town had ignored. "You mean Emily might have chosen to go?" Robert asked. Sophia nodded slowly. "The forest calls to certain souls. Those who listen are forever changed." Across town, Laura Johnson stood on her sister Maria's porch, heart pounding. They hadn't spoken properly since Emily vanished. Maria had blamed Laura for not watching her daughter closely enough, for not seeing the signs. "I didn't think you'd come," Maria said, opening the door wider. Laura stepped inside, noticing how her sister's home remained frozen in time. Photos of Emily still displayed prominently, as if awaiting her return. "I wouldn't have before the camera was found," Laura admitted, "but I can't do this alone anymore." The sisters sat at the kitchen table, years of unspoken grief between them. Maria poured coffee with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for blaming you, for everything." Laura reached across the table, taking her sister's hand. "We both lost her." As evening fell, they pored over the photographs from Emily's camera. Seeing details they'd missed before, Maria pointed to shadows in the background, shapes that seemed to follow Emily through the forest. "What if she's still out there?" Maria asked, voicing the hope they'd both harbored silently for 8 years. Laura's eyes filled with tears. Not just surviving. What if she's living, changed, but alive? The sisters embraced, their shared grief transforming into something stronger, a determination to uncover the truth, no matter how strange or terrifying it might be. As darkness settled over Eugene, Robert and Sophia laid out a map marked with disappearances spanning 80 years. Meanwhile, Laura and Maria made a pact to follow Emily's trail together. United by a fragile hope they barely dared to acknowledge, that somewhere in those ancient woods, Emily might be waiting to be found. Michael Brown hunched over his laptop, adjusting the microphone as he recorded the introduction to his new podcast, Finding Emily. The Wilderness Guide's hands trembled slightly as he spoke about his childhood friend who had vanished 8 years ago. Each episode would explore different aspects of Emily Johnson's disappearance, interviewing witnesses and examining evidence that the police might have overlooked. "I owe her this much," Michael whispered to himself, after finishing the first recording. His apartment walls were covered with maps of the Cascade forests, photos of the campsite, and printouts of police reports he'd managed to obtain through persistent requests and connections. The podcast gained traction quickly. Locals who remembered the case called in with tips, and amateur sleuths from across the country began analyzing the evidence he presented. Michael felt a glimmer of hope until the first message arrived. A plain envelope slipped under his door containing a single piece of paper with words cut from magazines. Some doors should remain closed. He dismissed it as a prank until more messages followed. "The forest keeps what it claims" appeared in his email from an untraceable account. "Stop digging or you'll be buried" was scrawled on his windshield one morning. Each warning grew more specific, referencing details from his podcast that only someone intimately familiar with Emily's case would know. Meanwhile, Laura Johnson's quiet life was being disrupted by inexplicable events. The porch light she'd kept burning for 8 years, a beacon for her daughter's return, now flickered erratically, sometimes blinking in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. She would wake to the sound of footsteps circling her house, only to find nothing but disturbed soil beneath her bedroom window. "I'm not imagining this," Laura insisted when Michael visited her home. She clutched a small swallow charm identical to the one they'd found in the wood. "Yesterday I smelled her shampoo, that strawberry scent she always used. It was so strong, Michael, like she had just walked past me." The Wilderness Guide nodded, believing her completely. He'd experienced his own strange encounters, the feeling of being watched while hiking familiar trails, recording equipment that malfunctioned only when he mentioned certain aspects of Emily's case. "Someone doesn't want us asking questions," he said, showing Laura the latest warning he'd received. "But I can't stop now. I think we're getting closer." That night, Laura sat alone on her porch, watching shadows move across her yard. The boundary between what she knew to be real and what she feared might be true had never felt thinner. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she heard her daughter's laughter carried on the wind. Not the child who disappeared, but someone older, wilder, and somehow still present. Detective Reyes hunched over his desk, headphones pressed tight against his ears. "Play it again," he instructed the technician. The audio from Emily Johnson's camera crackled through the speakers, distorted by water damage and time. Laura Johnson leaned forward, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. "There," the detective said, pausing the playback. "That's not just interference." Beneath the forest sounds, wind rustling leaves, distant birdsong was something else. A voice, barely perceptible, repeating "Lilam, Lilam." Emily's name spoken backward. Could be audio distortion, the technician suggested, but Laura knew better. She'd heard Emily practicing this very thing years ago, fascinated by palindromes and word games. "She used to do this," Laura whispered. "Record herself speaking backward, then reverse the tape." The detective nodded grimly. But who reversed it this time? Each new discovery pulled Laura deeper into a reality she couldn't comprehend. The symbols in the moss, the fern left at her doorstep, and now this, a ghostly echo calling her daughter's name in a code they once shared. Meanwhile, Michael Brown trekked through the dense Oregon wilderness, a printout of video stills clutched in his hand. The guilt that had shadowed him for 8 years drove him forward. If he had answered Emily's note that morning, perhaps she wouldn't have wandered off alone. "This has to be it," he muttered, pushing aside a curtain of overgrown ferns. Behind them, nearly invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look, was a narrow opening between two moss-covered boulders. The landmarks matched perfectly with the background of Emily's final video, the distinctive lightning-struck pine, the unusual rock formation resembling a crouching figure. The wilderness guide squeezed through the gap, finding himself on a path barely wide enough for a single person. The ground was soft, showing no recent footprints, yet somehow felt worn, as if countless feet had traveled this way over centuries. As Michael ventured deeper, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The hair on his arm stood on end as he felt rather than saw, eyes tracking his movement. "Hello," he called, immediately regretting breaking the silence. Something rustled in the underbrush to his left, then to his right, then behind him. Michael spun in circles, seeing nothing but shadows between trees. He pulled out his smartphone, recording as he walked. "I'm on some kind of hidden trail," he narrated softly. "Not marked on any map. The vegetation here is different, older somehow." A twig snapped somewhere ahead. Michael froze, camera still recording. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, a figure stood watching. Too tall to be 12-year-old Emily, but wearing what looked like her backpack. Before he could call out, the figure melted into the shadows, leaving Michael alone with the distinct feeling that he was being allowed to proceed, not as a searcher, but as someone being led. Michael Brown hunched over his laptop, his eyes burning from hours of staring at fragmented data. The memory card from Emily Johnson's camera had yielded one final secret: corrupted GPS coordinates. Though the main tag was wiped, fragments remained in the metadata, pointing to a location far beyond the boundaries of the school campsite. "Laura, I've got something," he called, his voice cracking with exhaustion. Laura Johnson looked up from the pile of maps spread across her kitchen table. 8 years of searching had etched permanent lines around her eyes, but today they shone with renewed purpose. "How far?" "Nearly 3 miles past the safety perimeter. It's an area the original search teams never reached." Within hours they were hiking through dense underbrush, following coordinates that led them deeper into the Cascade forests than either had ventured before. The wilderness guide moved with practiced efficiency, while Emily's mother kept pace behind him, clutching her daughter's photograph in her pocket like a talisman. "People avoid this section," Michael explained, pointing to a ridge ahead. "Local hunters call it the dead zone. No wildlife, no bird song, just silence." Laura shivered despite the warm afternoon. Emily's last video showed symbols carved into trees. "Keep your eyes open." As they crested a small hill, an abandoned ranger station emerged from the foliage, its windows boarded, roof partially collapsed. Nature had begun reclaiming the structure, with vines crawling up its weathered walls and moss carpeting the foundation. "This isn't on any of the park maps," Laura whispered, approaching cautiously. Inside, dust motes danced in beams of light, filtering through cracks in the boarded windows. Michael's flashlight beam swept across the floor, revealing boot prints in the dust. Some old, some disturbingly recent. "Someone's been here," he muttered, following the tracks to a corner where the floorboard seemed uneven. Pulling back a moldy carpet, they discovered a rusted metal hatch set into the concrete. "It's locked," Laura said, tugging at the corroded handle. Michael retrieved a crowbar from his backpack. Not for long. The hatch groaned open, revealing a narrow tunnel stretching into darkness. The air that escaped was damp and earthy, carrying the unmistakable scent of moss and decay. "This wasn't built by park rangers," Michael said, shining his light down the passage. "Poachers probably used it for illegal trapping decades ago." Laura gasped as the beam illuminated the tunnel wall. Carved into the stone were the same strange symbols Emily had filmed: concentric circles, branching lines like tree roots, and figures that seemed to dance between worlds. "She was here," Laura whispered, her voice trembling with both hope and terror. "My daughter was here." Michael nodded grimly, the weight of his childhood friend's fate heavy on his shoulders. "These symbols are fresh, not decades old." Together they stepped into the darkness, the tunnel air wrapping around them like a living thing. Watching, waiting, remembering. The beam of Laura Johnson's flashlight trembled across the damp tunnel walls, catching on something metallic wedged between two rocks. She knelt, her breath catching as she brushed away years of dirt to reveal a small brass compass, its surface scratched but still intact. The initials IL were crudely etched into the back. "Michael, look," she whispered, her voice echoing in the confined space. Laura's fingers traced the initials her daughter had carved so carefully. This was Emily's. Her father gave it to her for her 10th birthday. Michael Brown crouched beside her, his wilderness guide instincts already analyzing what this meant. How did it get here when the camera was found in the river? His face darkened with sudden realization. Unless someone moved it. When they emerged from the tunnel and confronted John Smith with their discovery, the retired firefighter broke down. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he confessed that during the original search, he'd found the compass but kept it hidden. "I couldn't bear to give you false hope," John admitted to Laura, his voice cracking. "We were so sure she was gone." The compass seemed like just another piece of heartbreak. Laura's rage and gratitude collided in a wave that left her speechless. 8 years of not knowing, while this man carried her daughter's possession in silence. Deeper into the tunnel network, their discoveries multiplied. A makeshift shelter formed from branches and plastic sheeting showed Emily's resourcefulness. Michael identified it immediately as a survival technique, one that required knowledge beyond what a typical 12-year-old would possess. "She was learning from somewhere," he murmured, examining the precise knots in the structure. They found a collection of carved wooden charms hanging from a low ceiling, birds, trees, and strange symbols matching those from the camera footage. Laura recognized her daughter's artistic style immediately, the careful attention to detail that Emily always showed in her drawings. Most telling were the food wrappers, granola bars, and trail mix packages dated from the week after her disappearance. Each wrapper had been neatly folded and stored, as if Emily was keeping track of time. "She survived at least 9 days after vanishing," Laura whispered, holding a wrapper with trembling hands. 9 days when everyone thought she was already gone. The evidence painted a portrait of Emily that broke Laura's heart anew. A child fighting to survive, crafting tools, creating art, leaving breadcrumbs that no one followed. She had been so close, so determined, so alive. Michael placed a gentle hand on Laura's shoulder. "She was smart, resourceful, and completely alone," Laura finished, her voice hollow with the weight of what might have been. Every discovery was both salvation and torment, proof her daughter had lived, but also that help had never come when Emily needed it most. Detective Mark Holloway, hash play on the final video clip, his expression grim as the screen flickered to life. Laura Johnson leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. The footage was distorted, the colors washed out and strange, but Emily's face filled the frame with startling clarity. Her daughter's eyes were wild yet focused, no trace of fear in them. Emily's gaze bored directly into the camera, as if she could see through time itself, through the years of searching and heartache. "I didn't go missing," Emily whispered, her voice steady and certain. "I was chosen." The camera swung violently to the right, capturing a figure standing in the shadows of the trees. Tall and thin, with long hair cascading down its back, the figure wore Emily's purple backpack, the one Laura had reported missing along with her daughter 8 years ago. The face remained obscured, turned away from the lens, but the posture was wrong, too tall, too mature to be her 12-year-old daughter. "Pause it," Laura gasped, her fingers digging into Michael Brown's arm. That can't be Emily." Michael rewound the footage frame by frame, his wilderness guide training giving him an eye for detail others might miss. "The backpack strap," he pointed out. "See how it's been extended? Emily was small for her age, but whoever this is..." Laura's mind raced back to the river photo they'd analyzed earlier. The reflection they'd all assumed was Emily. The realization crashed over her like ice water. It wasn't her in the reflection either. It was someone else. Wearing her clothes, Detective Holloway rubbed his temples. "So we're looking at what, a kidnapper? Someone who took her things?" Michael's rational mind, the part that had guided countless hikers safely through the Cascades, began to fracture around the edges. He thought of Robert Garcia's stories, of Sophia's warnings about the forest having its own will. Or maybe, he said, his voice barely audible, Emily has become part of something else. The legends Robert talks about, the echoing ones. Laura shook her head violently. No, that's my daughter's backpack. Those are her things. Someone took her. But even as she spoke, doubt crept in. The girl in the first videos was clearly Emily, curious, observant, speaking of patterns and voices. The figure in the shadows was something else entirely. We need to go back to that river, Michael said firmly, where John found the camera. Whatever happened to Emily, whatever she became or whoever took her, the answer is out there in those woods. Laura stared at the frozen image on the screen, at the shadowy figure wearing her daughter's backpack. Was Emily truly missing all these years, or had she transformed into something else entirely, something that belonged to the forest now? Laura Johnson and Michael Brown pushed through a tangle of overgrown ferns, their footsteps muffled by decades of fallen pine needles. The air grew still as they entered a circular clearing surrounded by towering cedars, their ancient trunks twisted like guardians. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating dust motes that danced in the hushed air. "Do you hear that?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Laura nodded. The birdsong had changed, not silenced, but altered, as if the birds were singing in a different key, their calls echoing strangely among the trees. At the center of the grove lay a collection of objects, arranged with eerie precision. A faded red sneaker, small enough for a child of 8, a plastic school badge from 1976, a metal lunchbox rusted but recognizable, Polaroid photographs with colors leached by time. Each item belonged to someone who had vanished, preserved as if placed there yesterday. "They're all here," Laura breathed, recognizing the pattern Robert had documented. Every 8 years, every missing child. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a small wooden box nestled among exposed tree roots. Inside, protected from the elements, lay a photograph not weathered like the others, but crisp and recent. Laura's heart stuttered as she recognized the subject. Emily, not the 12-year-old who had disappeared, but a young woman of 20. Her daughter's features had matured, cheekbones more defined, eyes deeper set, but unmistakably her. She stood half-hidden behind a tree, watching the camera with an unsmiling intensity. Her hair hung wild past her shoulders, and she wore what appeared to be handmade clothing of leather and woven plant fibers. "It's her," Laura whispered, her voice breaking. "She's alive." Michael stared at the photo, his face draining of color. "This can't be more than a few months old." Laura's legs gave way beneath her. She sank to the forest floor, clutching the photograph to her chest as sobs racked her body. 8 years of searching, of hoping against hope, had led to this impossible truth. Emily hadn't been taken, she had chosen the forest over returning home. She found what she was looking for, Laura said between ragged breaths. The stories, the symbols. She wasn't running from something. She was running toward it. Michael knelt beside her, his own eyes wet with tears. The forest became her sanctuary. Around them, the trees seemed to lean closer, their shadows deepening despite the afternoon sun. Laura felt the weight of her discovery, both miracle and tragedy settle into her bones. Her daughter lived, transformed by the wild, part of something ancient and unknowable. "She's not coming back," Laura whispered, understanding finally dawning. She never was. Laura Johnson sat at her kitchen table, staring at the collection of evidence they'd gathered. The pink camera, now cleaned and preserved in an evidence bag, seemed to mock her with its secrets. 8 years of searching, of sleepless nights and false hopes, had led to a truth so strange she could barely comprehend it. "It was all there," she whispered to Michael Brown, who sat across from her, his wilderness guide jacket still damp from their expedition. Every sign pointed to her choice, not her abduction. The clues had been scattered like breadcrumbs from the beginning. Emily's journal entries about feeling more at home among trees than people, her fascination with Robert's grandmother's stories, the way she'd press leaves and ferns between book pages, as if preserving pieces of a world she longed to join. "I kept looking for a villain," Laura said, her voice breaking. "Someone to blame. But the forest itself was calling." Michael nodded, his eyes reflecting years of unresolved guilt now transformed into something like acceptance. "She was special, The woods recognized something in her that we couldn't see. Outside, Eugene continued its ordinary rhythms. Cars passing, neighbors walking dogs, oblivious to the extraordinary revelation unfolding in Laura's modest home. The cost of their discovery weighed heavily. 8 years lost, relationships fractured, innocence shattered. Laura's estrangement from Maria had only recently begun to heal, both sisters scarred by accusations, hurled in grief's darkest moments. "Sophia told me something yesterday," Michael said, referring to Robert's grandmother. "She said some people aren't meant to be found because they've found themselves instead." Laura traced the outline of Emily's last photo with her fingertip. Her daughter, no longer 12 but nearly 20, looked wild and knowing, at peace in a way she never had been in the conventional world. "What will you tell people?" Michael asked gently. "The truth," Laura replied. "Or at least part of it. That she survived, that she's out there. The rest," she shook her head, "the rest belongs to Emily." Michael had already transformed his search podcast into something deeper, a chronicle of the Cascades mysteries, of disappearances that might be choices, of a forest that sometimes claims those who understand its language. His listeners had tripled, drawn to the haunting possibility that some lost souls might choose to remain unfound. "The legends were true," Laura murmured, "just not in the way we understood them." As dusk fell, she placed Emily's compass on the windowsill facing the distant tree line, not as a beacon to call her daughter home, but as acknowledgement that some journeys lead away from what we know, into realms we can barely imagine, and that sometimes letting go is the truest form of love. Laura Johnson stood at the mouth of the moss-covered cave, her fingers trembling as they clutched the final photograph. The image showed Emily, not the 12-year-old who had vanished, but a teenager with wild hair and knowing eyes, standing confidently among the shadows. 8 years of searching, of hoping against hope, and now this undeniable truth stared back at her. "You chose this," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustling of leaves. The forest seemed to breathe around her, alive with secrets older than the town itself. She traced her daughter's face in the photograph, remembering the videos they'd recovered from the pink camera. Emily's words echoed in her mind. "I didn't go missing. I was chosen. Not a victim, but a willing participant in something beyond understanding." Michael Brown waited several yards back, giving her this moment alone. The wilderness guide had devoted years to finding his childhood friend, driven by the guilt of that ignored note. Now he watched Laura's shoulders rise and fall with deep breaths as she made peace with the impossible. "She's still out there," Laura said when she finally turned back to him, her eyes red but dry. "Not lost, just transformed." The wind picked up suddenly, sending leaves spiraling around them. For a heartbeat, Laura felt eyes upon her, watching, assessing, perhaps even loving, from deep within the forest's embrace. She didn't turn to look. Some truths were better left in shadow. "Robert's grandmother was right," she said, tucking the photograph into her pocket. "The forest doesn't just take, it receives." Michael nodded, remembering Sophia's words about the echoing ones and the ancient pact between people and wilderness. The podcast he'd created had brought attention to Emily's case, but some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, only accepted. As they began their journey back to town, Laura felt a strange lightness. The grief remained, but transformed like Emily herself. Her daughter hadn't been stolen. She'd found belonging in this wild place, where moss grew thick and legends breathed. At the forest's edge, Laura paused one last time. She thought of Helen's confession, of Anna's botanical discoveries, of the patterns Robert had mapped out across generations. Every 8 years, someone disappeared. Every 8 years, the forest called. "Goodbye," she whispered. Not to Emily, but to her own desperate search. The girl in the photograph wasn't lost. She was home. Behind them, unseen in the deepening shadows, a teenage girl with Emily's eyes and a stranger's grace watched them leave. The forest had given her something the human world couldn't: purpose, belonging, mystery. She turned away as her mother's figure disappeared down the trail, knowing some choices, once made, reshape everything that follows. The forest, echoing with ancient secrets, would never let her be forgotten.